Hey everyone, welcome back to the shop. Craig Woodworking here. And today we're going to be doing a very simple project. In fact, this is the first project I think anyone should ever do if they want to try woodworking or want to get into woodworking. It takes minimal tools. You don't really need many at all, if any. If you have someone, a friend that's a woodworker already, you can ask them for some of their scraps, and then all you need is just some sandpaper. But if you want to actually get your first tool, one of your first tools you should purchase is probably a saw. Now this is a simple Husky saw that I picked up at my local home center. I think it was $15, nothing too much. Also, a speed square is nice to have just in case you want to draw a straight line. A pencil, and an optional tool, one that is probably just an optional tool if you want to try something different, would be a spoke shave. Now the spoke shave is one of my favorite tools. Very versatile, and you can do so much with just this one tool. Let's get into it. Alright, first, lumber, wood. Well, if we're making a cutting board, we want to talk about wood for a second. We want to use some hardwoods. Not any hardwood though, because there's some hardwoods out there that are toxic, the dust is nasty, or even just not conducive for food safe items, or is considered to be food safe. If you're doing a cutting board, you do want it to be food safe, so I recommend any domestic hardwood. That would be maple, cherry, walnut. Today we're going to be using some hard maple. This is a piece of scrap hard maple that I had from a project, and let's get into it. We're going to start turning this into a cutting board. Alright, to start, we're going to want to section off a piece of the wood. A piece of the wood that will actually become the cutting board. Now this piece of wood has some defects over here, which I'm going to try to avoid just to make it easier for us, easier for me to work with. And honestly, this is just a simple, small cutting board, so we only need a piece about this big. Let's see how big that actually is. 12 inches, 13 inches, 14 inches, you can even go 8 inches if you want. This could be a small cheese board, a charcuterie board, whatever you want. I'm actually going to cut right here at 13 because that's where the defect stops. So let's go ahead and get into that. I'm going to take my speed square, I'm going to line it up to where I want my cut to be, take my pencil, scribe a line across, and this is going to be my keep side, this is going to be my cut side. Let's cut it. Alright, we're ready to cut. What if you don't have a woodworking bench? What if you don't have a woodworking vise? What if you don't have a woodworking shop? How am I going to cut this wood then? Well, you can cut it a couple different ways. You could put it on a stool, you could put it on the edge of a table, you could put it on a step, you could even cut it on a bench if you had a small sitting bench somewhere. I'm going to fasten mine down using some clamps onto some sawhorses. Sawhorses are an easy project to build or even cheap to pick up yourself. So I got my sawhorses ready right here. I'm going to get my piece of wood, put it across, and take 2 clamps and clamp them down. Alright, before you start cutting, let's talk about the saw real quick. The saw is a simple saw. I believe this is a cross-cut saw. I don't remember how many tooth per inch it is, but very easy to use. One little trick when you're using saws is don't force the saw to do the work. Let the saw do the work itself. So a lot of people, when they first grab a saw, they're gonna grip it real tight and they're gonna push it real hard into the wood. That's not what you wanna do. You're gonna just break a sweat and not really cut that well and possibly even make a mistake. You wanna easy put the saw on the wood and then slowly start pulling back and forth on it. Pulling back and forth slowly on the saw. I'm not pushing the saw down, I am only pushing forward. My force applied is directly forward across the piece of wood, not down into the piece of wood. Pretend like you're reaching out to shake someone's hand, or even like if you're bowling, you know how when you bowl, you want to swing your arm straight forward? It's the same motion. Kind of looks like the arm of a choo-choo train. You just want to go back and forth, back and forth. Don't want to angle, don't want to be skewed, you just want to go back and forth. I'm really close to the end of the piece of wood here. If I keep sawing, the piece over here, the piece on my workpiece, might fall and crack on the bottom. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna keep sawing, and then I'm gonna reach over and grab the piece, and then slowly saw. There you go. You made your first cut. Hooray! As you can see, it's not perfect. I'm actually on a little bit of a slant there, but that's okay because this is just gonna be a cutting board. You don't have to cut straight lines for this. In fact, it's gonna probably give it its little character. You could spoke shave that off if you want, or you can go back at it with a saw if it's gonna bother you. That's it, that's what we need. A piece of wood, and all the hard work is kind of done. Now comes the fun part. So we're done cutting the piece of wood. You can put your saw away, you don't need it anymore, unless you want to fine tune this edge or even maybe cut off the corners to give it a little more artistic feel to your cutting board, or whatever you want to do. Really, you just want to cut a piece of wood down to a rectangle shape or a square shape. Then, after you have that, what are we going to do? We are going to take some sandpaper. This is an optional thing. You can either use sandpaper now, or if you went ahead and bought a spoke shave, you can use a spoke shave. Let's use the sandpaper first. So with the low grit, this is 60 grit paper, you want to take your piece of wood and just start sanding the edges. You're not trying to go crazy on this. All you're really trying to do is what we call in woodworking, break the edge. Take a sharp corner and making it soft, or making it rounded so it doesn't hurt whenever you grab it, or even if you slide your fingers across it, it doesn't cut it. You can cut your fingers on wood if the piece of wood is a little too tight. Or too sharp, not too tight. You don't need a sanding block because you can actually curve the piece of sandpaper the way you want in order to get the profile you would like. So you're going to do that on all edges. There's no real wrong way to do this as long as you're working to break those edges. As you can see, or maybe you can't see, my edges are nice and round here. That could be it. That's all you really need to do. So if you want to just break the edges a little bit here, I recommend do all the edges. So 1, 2, 3, 4 edges, and then also you want to get the end grain here as well. You can do that on all the corners or all of the edges with just some sandpaper. After you do it with a low grit, you use 60 or 80 grit, you want to go up to the next one, 120. After you use 120, you want to go up to the next one, 220. And then when you're at 120 or 220, that's when you want to sand the surfaces or the faces of the piece of wood. So you want to sand this face and this face as well. If you got the spoke shave, you want to go a traditional route. You want to use hand tools. You don't want to make this much sawdust. Or maybe you're working inside of an apartment or a house. Well, you can use a spoke shave then to break the edges. Again, you don't need a woodworking bench to do this. You don't really need a vise to do this. You can clamp it down if you want. You can hold it in your hand. If you hold it in your hand, just be aware of where your fingers are and how you're holding the spoke shave. As you might see, or might be able to tell, it's easier to break the edges with a spoke shave than the sandpaper. There's less dust. You are able to remove more wood faster, and you can add a little more, you can add more of a profile to the edges here as well. So let's go around and do it on the other side now too. So we got the long edges roughed out. They're softer, they've broken the corners, broken the edges. Now we gotta do the end grain. So same deal, you can use your sandpaper or your spoke shave to do this. I love my spoke shave, so I'm gonna keep using my spoke shave. You don't have to use a spoke shave to get this project done. You can simply get it done with sandpaper and a cheap saw that you can get at your home center. Now, if you're gonna do this project with someone who's young, or maybe one of your children, or a niece or a nephew, or even if you're a teacher and you want to do this with some of your students, it would be smart to get some clamps and then clamp the piece down to a bench or a table. So in that way, they're using two hands to work on the piece. 2 clamps are better than 1, keeps it standing still. And it makes it a little easier to use. And when you get a nice profile on that one, flip it over, do the other end grain. That's nice. You could also use these clamps and this method to do the long edges as well on the piece of wood. Let me show you how. Now the same method as you were doing on the end grain, you can just push along the side with the spoke shave. Once you get the profile you want, flip it over and do the other side. It's a very simple project. Don't overthink it. There's no wrong way to do this. There's no right way to do this. As long as you're just breaking the edges of the piece of wood to make it easier to hold in your hands, there you go. Now, remember my bad cut up here that I did? Well, I'm actually gonna leave that angle. I think it kind of just gives a little characteristic to the piece of wood. I'm gonna break that edge like I did all my others. But let's bring you in for a closer look for that one. See what's happening here? It's coming off the edge. It's called blowout when that happens. Don't worry if that happens. You can clean it up with sandpaper later. There you go. All the edges are broken, nice and soft to grab. No more sharp edges. I'll hit the corners here on all the pieces, all 4 corners, with some sandpaper. Now it's time just to do some finish sanding. It's a very simple project. Don't overthink it. You got all your edges broken, either with sandpaper or with a spoke shave. Either way, you're gonna have fun. You're gonna be making something with your hands, and you're gonna be enjoying the hobby. Again, the idea of this project is just to get someone started in the hobby to see if they'll like it. Or even if yourself, you're not sure, you don't want to go and buy $100 worth of tools and realize you don't actually like making sawdust or building things with your hands. So this is a great one for anyone to try. Now we're at the point where we have to do some sanding, some finish sanding. So 2 options here. You can sand by hand, like we did earlier, where you take a low grit sandpaper. This is 150. And you just go with the grain. Don't go across. If you go across the grain, you get these scratch marks that are going to be really visible and hard to get out. So you always want to make sure you're sanding with the grain. So you can sand the whole piece, all the edges again, all the corners like this by hand. But if you want to speed things up, you could use a random orbital sander. It's another good first purchase in woodworking if you want, because every woodworking project you do has sanding involved. So if you're thinking about getting into the hobby, this might be a good thing to pick up. You might be asking right now, how do I know when I've sanded enough? Well, again, there's no way of doing this project wrong as long as you just do the project. But one tip I remember seeing in a Wood Whisperer video, take your pencil and then lightly make some swirls across. And then sand until all those pencil marks are gone. Last trick. Whenever you're making things out of wood that you know you're going to be washing, be it a spatula, a cutting board, a wooden bowl, or anything like that, or actually it doesn't have to be something that you'll be washing or be using with food. There is a process called raising the grain before you sand with your final grit. My final grit for this project is going to be 220, and the way I'm going to raise the grain is very easy. I'm just going to get a spray bottle with some water in it. Just spray the piece of wood. What this will do is, anytime the piece of wood gets wet, it's not going to feel fuzzy after it's wet. You're going to let it get wet, you're going to get it sprayed with water, you can let it dry, or take a piece of paper towel, wipe it up, And it should feel fuzzy right now. It was smooth before, but now it's feeling fuzzy. And then now, we'll switch to sandpaper and go at it with one final grit. There you go. You're done. You made your cutting board. You made your very first project. Again, you can do this, but anyone can do this. You can do this with your children. You can do this with your nieces and nephews. You can do this with your students. It's a very simple, easy project for anyone to do, just to try woodworking. Woodworking is a fun hobby. It's an amazing hobby. It's really great. Oh, one last thing. You might want to put finish on this. Easy finish. Mineral oil. I use this a lot of my projects, especially my ones that I know that food's going to interact with the piece itself. It's a food safe finish, very easy to apply. There's no waiting time. You can just put it on, wipe it on. You can do multiple coats if you want. You can get this at you can get this at a grocery store, a drugstore. Do 2 to 3 coats. Let it soak in for 30 minutes to an hour in between coats. Wipe off any excess, and then put more on top. You got your project done, your very first woodworking project. If you're new to the hobby, welcome. Woodworking is a lot of fun. If you're new to this channel, please hit the subscribe button. And if you like this video, go ahead and hit thumbs up. It helps us out. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or even want to give us ideas for our next video, please leave them in the comments down below. Thank you, and have a great day.